Welcome to another session of Bold Moves. Our episode is about leaders making decision in complexity and not always having the answers, but being a builder at the end anyway. Today, I have Uvri with me. She is my unique guest in a sense organization. She is able to detect what is not connecting and help organization grow and improve. Thank you for being here, Irby, today.
Thank you for having me, Mary. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
People walk into a company trying to find what's broken. You're looking at what's not connected, and what actually that looks like and how it's impacting the organization. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think when we look at companies, we build companies with certain functions. You have your sales, you have your marketing, you have your operation, you have finance, engineering. But one of the things that happens when you do that, especially with larger companies, not so much startups, but when you get to become larger, people have specific roles. And when you have this specific roles, then you do the job that you're supposed to do. You don't necessarily look at what the other organizations are doing. And so when you become so siloed in the work that you're doing, people are not necessarily on the same page on what the company is moving forward with, right? They're literally executing on their roles. And I think that's the part that people are missing, is that you always need people not just at the senior leader levels, but even at the execution levels to be talking to their peers in other organizations. Because this not only creates, well, it creates the human element, which is the fact that you're talking with other organizations, but it also helps you see whether there's gaps in things that you're actually doing for the work that you're executing on.
Where do you see that businesses are getting that human infrastructure wrong in businesses?
Well, I think in today's day, so one, I think the world has changed in terms of how we do work, what work we do, what we bring to the table. And I think the fact that organizations are still using an outdated model of creating a job description and then hiring people based on a resume is garbage in, garbage out. A resume only tells people or tells an organization what somebody has done. I think in today's day and age, the work that we're doing is constantly changing. With AI coming in, with culture coming in, with 5 generations in the workforce, the way we're doing business is very different. So if you're only hiring people for what they've done, then you're missing out on 3 big components, which is who are they? Like, what's their personality? What are their values? How do they think? Things like that. But you're also missing out on, okay, but where do they want to go? Right? I think it's important in today's day and age for people to be able to articulate where they're trying to go. But lastly, just because you've done something doesn't mean that that's what you want to be doing in the future, meaning that's not necessarily what you're offering an organization. And so with an organization, if you're only looking at what they've done, then you're probably missing out on the actual potential employees that could be the right fit for the job or where the company is actually going. Because as we look at every company is trying to move to the future. And how you move to the future is not the same. It's not cookie cutter. This is the way we used to do it. Therefore, we're going to do it that way. It's actually very different. And so you need to start hiring the people who can actually move you to the future and not just do the job.
And that's a very interesting point you bring up. So if not resume, what should an employer what should an employer or the hiring manager be looking at? Because those interview process are very specific and they go around really quickly.
Absolutely. It was something I started working on in 2018. I started a company called peppercorn.ai at the time. It is now shut down. But our goal was actually to start collecting information from both sides that actually articulated who they are, where they're going, and what they offer from a candidate. And then be able to match it against who a company is, where they're going, and what they offer, right? So not just a generic job description, not just a resume. It was about asking questions that a person would do once based on themselves. And then that became what you would call the future resume. So it could still be a document, but it's not a resume that you keep tweaking based on what job you're applying to. It would become one document that you would always use to tell a company a little bit about yourself. And since companies are using AI anyway, it's data points. You match against the data points to be able to see which is the best fit rather than matching upon AI just looking for certain words, meaning we would teach the AI to be a little bit smarter to understand the underlying strategic insights about a person, not just, oh, look for these keywords. Because even today, when a lot of companies say they use AI and ATS systems, it's actually just looking for keywords, which is not the right way to do it.
How is future of work or future of recruiting can pick those elements up?
Again, I think maybe I had to clearly articulate it, but the goal is each side, whether it's the employee, the candidate, or the company, a company also needs to define those same data points. They
I
need to
see.
be able to
Okay.
define where they're going as a company, what they offer to candidates, because it's become much more important for candidates. What are you giving to me as a company? How can I grow? Or what kind of culture are you giving me? It's beyond just a salary and benefits, right? And then the last thing is, where are you going? What are you offering me? And who are you as a company? Right? How has the company defined their brand? Which actually gets into something that I work on, is companies actually need to not only think about their marketing and brand from an external perspective, but they need to do a lot more work on having internal brand that their employees and their candidates can actually live upon, and not live upon just because it's words, but because they think that way. They have the same values, right? There's things that make it a natural fit rather than trying to fit into boxes, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That leads me to my next question. Across all environments you have worked on, Fortune 10, startups,
Oh,
global teams, what patterns keeps on repeating even when context changes?
I think one of the patterns that keep happening is that, and especially in the last, I would say last 5 or 6 years, is the change of pace that is happening in the market is happening a lot faster. But people think they're going to be doing their job, or they're still looking at 5-year plans, things that are way in the future, when honestly, you need to constantly look at your business for what it is today so that you can get to tomorrow. And so I think it's a mindset that needs to change across, all organizations, that if you don't empower your people to be constantly looking outside also, and going beyond their silos or going beyond their roles or upskilling them, right? You know, we shouldn't be relying on a candidate to upskill themselves. We need to, or inside the organizations, be able to support our employees to think differently and work faster, learn new tools, bring ideas to the table that they otherwise wouldn't, because they're just going after a long-term goal rather than looking at the business for what it is today.
Where do you see when the breakdown happens? Is it system or is it people not, really having the right skills?
I think it's a combination of both, right? Because definitely it's the people not having the right skills, but also a lot of times not being empowered to make changes. But if the system, if the people are behind, then the systems also don't change, right? So, at some point, somewhere along the line, whether it's a senior leader, whether it's somebody executing a strategy, needs to be able to see that something is not working. But A lot of times in organizations, you do the way it's been done because that's the way it's been done. Nobody, I mean, not all organizations, there are some great organizations which the curiosity is there and people are looking at and saying, okay, why are we doing what we're doing, right? And then they're able to change it. But if we don't empower your teams to say, why are we doing what we're doing? And is it actually getting us to where we need to get to? It doesn't work. But I will say the other bigger thing, which is going back to the human element, which we talked about earlier, it sometimes becomes a people thing because once you have lots of people together, everyone has their perspectives. Everyone has their own backgrounds. Everyone has their own personalities and values. And when people don't articulate or collaborate together and they just do their work, that is a breakdown in communication because if you can't collaborate on ideas and moving forward, then you're actually hurting the business because the business needs to move at the pace of whatever business is going at today. I think what happens as a third culture kid is that you get so many different perspectives on people, on culture, on how things work, how people think, that when you go into something new, you don't really have as many biases as other people. And I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but the reason being is that every time you go into something new, you go in with a mindset of, I'm going to learn first. I'm going to see what the lay of the land is like. I'm going to see what kind of people are there. I'm going to see the way people are thinking. I need to learn the culture of this company. I'm not just going in and, saying, okay, this is the way it's going to be, even as a leader, when I go into organization, to understand that what you may know may be very different from what is actually happening somewhere. I have a couple of clients that are of French origin. When I work with them, you know, lunchtime, early hours, late hours, they do not happen. That's not acceptable because culturally, you know, they take that time off. And it's not that they work less, it's just that they are very strong about that is their time, that is the time off, that is not meant to be working at my desk and eating in front of my computer. Whereas in the States, right, you will see lots of people who will eat at their desks, or I can have early morning conversations with them or late night conversations with them because they're open to it and they're, in some ways, they're willing to be flexible on when they can have the conversations, right? So even just small little things like that. Now, if you take it to a business level, it creates a lot of different perspectives, different ways of working, different ways of bringing things to the table. Some people will agree with an idea, but they'll debate it before it is agreed upon. Okay. And for some people, debating an idea is not a positive way of trying to accept an idea, right? Whereas there's somebody else who could be like, I'm collaborating. I'm going to come up with some parts of the idea. It'd be great to talk through it to create and understand what is possible versus a debate. Somebody might think of it as defensive and think that, oh, well, we need to find out everything that could be challenging. So do you see, even in an organization, if you bring something to the table and it's a debate and it becomes a challenge, it's about finding the challenges versus you bring something to the table and it's finding out all the positives that can happen. It creates a different type of tension in the room. And so as human beings, we need to understand, how do people think? How do people actually work together? Because both of those could create different answers and different tensions and different situations in an organization.
So you would say that it's just it gives you insight into how different dynamics work,
It gives
and
me a
being
different
able.
insight into how dynamics work for sure. I think that's the number one thing. The other thing I was going to say is I think it makes my superpower becomes that I can go into a room and if we're looking at a problem and I'm trying to solve for it, I could take from different industries, I could take from different cultures, I could take from different functions, because I've also worked in multiple industries. I've worked in multiple functions and I've worked globally. So when you can connect the dots, right? So as a third culture kid, one of the biggest things that I do is connect the dots between people, projects, ideas. Throughout my life, I feel like that is the one thing that I'm constantly doing is seeing how something maps out to something else that other people don't think about. The way I like to describe it as an example is like if somebody gives you a problem and you're in let's say the problem starts in the lower left-hand side of a page and everyone gives their answer and everyone has different paths, but they all kind of came up with the same answer, right? And that answer's in the upper right hand side of the page. And for me, I'd be like outside the page. My solution is nowhere even close to what people are looking at. And by the way, it's not that it's right or wrong. And then when I see everybody else's answer, I'm thinking to myself, well, how did they get there? And I'm asking questions. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying I'm asking questions because now I get a different perspective. But maybe there's some truth in the answer I have too, because I'm looking at it very differently. And so I think being global, being in different functions, being in different industries, you learn how to look at everything very differently. That's an interesting question. I think it's all dependent on each organization. I think it again goes back to what I've been talking about this whole time. Like even leaders themselves, each of them is different, right? Each of them has a different perspective. I would almost say that really depends on the organization.
Has there been a moment where you misread something?
I will say that 90% of the time, in the first minute, I may misread something, always. Because in that first minute, when I walk into something new, I'm basing whatever I'm piecing together based on my past experiences, right? So I'm trying to put the lens of going into a professional networking event and probably putting the lens of what I've been to in the last week, maybe, right? Or, depending on where it is. Or am I going to meet a client? And, maybe it's an Indian client, right? And the brain as a human being is still going to do what it does, right? I'm making sure I'm pulling back and I'm reading the room in a different way, right? I'm actually going to pay attention to what somebody is saying and how they're behaving, who they're talking to, where they're sitting, what is top of mind for them, what are the things that like if I'm sitting with a client, what is something the client is saying over and over again, which could be different from what they're telling me they want from me, right? And being able to ask the questions and say, hey, I keep hearing this, but then you're saying you want me to do this. Which one's the priority? Right? Or why are you talking? And I do have a habit of asking the questions because I'm always trying to clarify. I don't want to assume what's happening. And so I know that the questions I'm asking are to help me not be wrong, even though I know that in that first minute, as my brain is processing, I'm probably wrong. It's also to not go on autopilot, right? I think sometimes as humans, and this is in organizations, socially, professionally, we go on autopilot rather than let me step back and look at each situation for what it is instead of assuming that it's just like another situation.
So that takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of curiosity on your part, and not going through the autopilot process and just learning and relearning every single time.
Yes.
So, for someone leading teams right now, what's the one thing they should be paying attention to that they're probably not?
I think one of the things leaders are not able to, and it's not because they don't want to, but they're not able to, is their people. Really understanding their people beyond just I'm a leader and I need to have a cohesive team and my team needs to be executing. But understanding the dynamics of the different generations in the workforce, the different ways of working in the workforce. How is the external world affecting their own team members, right? what is happening in those team members' lives that can affect what they bring to the table from a business perspective, right? One of my biggest topics that I talk about is women in the workforce, especially those at leadership levels, because companies are not understanding the physical and mental load that women have beyond the beyond that they have outside the company, and everything that they're taking care of and still coming up. And the topic that I like to talk about is going through their pauses in life, so to say, right? So all the perimenopause, menopause, all that kind of stuff. And so if organizations are not paying attention to their people, and for me, I'm passionate about the women in the organizations, they're really going to lose out on bringing their companies forward in a way that benefits them in the long run, because culture and business is changing so drastically. Well, I think before a leader even approaches their teams, I think they need to go back at a company level and make sure that as a company, everyone is on the same page, that a little bit of time is needed for the human element, that it's not just an HR thing. Like, it is something that is important for businesses as they move forward. As much as AI is there, AI could actually help a little bit, but AI is not going to take over, number one. So I think companies need to look back and say, no matter what organization they're in, do they have the right people? Are they understanding what their people, right? And I think if they do it more at a company level, then the pressure on a leader to do it individually becomes a little bit less. What I mean by this a little bit is, even if we look at a perspective of a leader asking their own team members, where do they want to go in the future? And what do they offer? Instead of just saying, oh, you did this project. Okay, your performance review is based on what you did and whether you did it right or not. If we can just add a little bit and say, okay, this is what you did, but where are you trying to go in your career? And what are you thinking of offering in the future? Which, once you start collecting that data at a company-wide level, you can start putting programs in to upskill your people or support them in professional development or many other ways. I don't think it's necessary for the individual leader to do anything with their team immediately. I believe leaders need to be talking collectively to understand how they can do that for the company together, to then help the individuals in the long run.
So you're approaching it at a more of a higher level versus
Yes,
individual leadership level. Got it. Okay.
absolutely.
So, if someone feels is something wrong in the organization but cannot quite name it, where should they start?
And are we talking about like the business itself or the people or
Could be anything. It could be
yeah,
systems. It could be people. Like you said, where earlier you mentioned that disconnect.
yes.
Where would you start?
I mean, that is definitely something you start with your team. You start trying to get the team to look at things and say, where do they see, instead of asking the question, where do they see the gaps? It's more about, what do you need to do your job better? What support do you need to take us to the future and execute on your role, right? When you start looking at that, and if you see your team actually listing things, that means those are the gaps. Those are the gaps of what is required to get the business forward. So let me give you an example. I recently met with a company, and they're really great at what they do, and they know how they do it too. Meaning, when they're going into a client, they're not doing cookie cutter consulting with them. They're actually sitting with the client and finding solutions and then executing. But internally, when you ask, because when they want to look at each of their people and they want their people to go out and sell, nobody is able to sell because they can't actually say what they do. So the
That's
question
the
asked,
complexity.
right?
That's complex. Yeah.
Right. So the question that was asked is not, what is the gap? The question asked is, okay, if we want everyone on the team to be able to sell, what's missing? Everyone was like, well, what's missing is I don't know what to say, right?
Right.
And so now you have the gap. The gap is not that the work can't be done. It's a specific sales can't be done because you don't have the words. Okay, so now we need to go in and create the words for everybody to be able to sell. But it also is not just traditional marketing. It's the employee brand, it's the employee marketing, but it also needs to be in such a way that everyone can do it, meaning it has to be simple. It can't be, big words that are just going to be picked up by AI. It has to be from a human element. How does any one person just say what they do, right? And so that's a gap. That's something that needs to be solved for.
That's very interesting perspective because it goes back to what you mentioned. People really understanding their roles and their brand of the company, and
Yes,
really, yeah, and not being checked in a box where they can't just be checking off
exactly.
things, but exactly really understanding the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to say thank you for all your wonderful insight. I appreciate your time with Bold Moves, and to our audiences, please forward this to anyone that you find in leadership position. Definitely RV gave us really good little good advice on how to navigate complexities in organizations. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
You too.